Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to continue the style stage of our project and style the skip-nav link as well as our global header. Before we dive into that, we have a couple of housekeeping items from our last episode that we need to take care of. The first thing is that we have a typo in our box sizing for HTML reset, so let's just get that fixed up real quick. Next up, we have a hard-coded hex value for the background color on the body reset style, and we can actually replace that with our variable for the white color. So let's get color white put in there. That's looking good. Another reset style that we neglected to put in on our first pass was to reset the margin on the body as well. So if we give that a save, you'll notice in our live preview here that we no longer have any gap around our content. And that'll give us a nice baseline for providing paddings within our elements and getting the spacing that we're looking for. Another thing I noticed is our placeholder text for our global search has a little typo in it. So that should say turmeric, not turmeric. Let me get that cleaned up real quick. So in our placeholder here, for our input, let's make sure that says turmeric. That's looking good. And the last thing I wanted to add before we start styling out the components for our UI is just a small CSS variable here for our transition. So let's put this in a section that we can call design elements. Things like box shadows can go here, border radii, things like that. So let's say our global transition is going to be 300 milliseconds, and we'll use an easing curve of ease in out. It's looking good. And we also have a couple different border radius properties. If you look at our design here, for these large cards, we have a border radius of 8 pixels. And then in this episode, we're going to start tackling our skip-nav link, and that has a tighter border radius of 4 pixels. So we can say that our border radius default is 0.4 rems, and our border radius large is 0.8 rems. Cool, and that should set us up nicely for building out our UI components now. So to dive right in, I mentioned that we're going to start with our skip-nav link that we see right here in our mockup. And if we reference our HTML, we can see that it's just a simple link that points to an anchor ID. So before we add CSS, let's give this a class, and we'll just call it skip-nav. And then in our CSS file, we can scroll all the way down and start a new section in our file. Let's put in a section comment here that says skip-nav and begin styling with our block. So looking visually at our skip-nav here, we have a background color of our default charcoal value. That'll be charcoal 21. It looks like the color of our text is going to be color white. Next up, we can use that new border radius variable we just added. So this will have the default border radius of 0.4 rems or 4 pixel equivalent. And we also know that the padding of this is going to be our space default, which is equal to 16 pixels. If we give this a save and take a look at our preview here, you'll notice that it's starting to look a little bit closer. One thing that we need to do though is make sure this is set to display inline block. So that way it sits within the document flow and can receive box sizing properties as needed. Next up, let's get rid of that text decoration that we see on the link by default. And we'll give that a save. It's looking good. One thing that I forgot here, if we look at our designs, is this is using the same type spec as our global navigation and some of the other UI elements here. And it's actually the copy large type class that we created in the previous episode. So tcopy large, we'll want to apply that as a type utility class to our skip-nav link here. So tcopy large, give that a save. That's looking a little bit closer to our mockup here. And this mockup is when we are focusing this element. So by default, if we look at our other mockups in this prototype, you shouldn't see the skip-nav at all. And when it receives keyboard focus, we'll want to bring it onto the page with this focus style. So one thing that we can do is using our inspector tools, we can force the state on focus, and that'll allow us to get our focus styles in here. And then we'll add the styles for the unfocused state which will bring it off of the page and visually hide it. All right, going back into our CSS file here. All right, so let's get a couple of the states added here. So we can tackle hover real quick. Skip nav, hover. The background color in this case will darken to our darkest charcoal value. And that reminds me that we actually need to add our transition up here. So we can use our transition variable that we added. And it's always good with transition to be explicit around which properties you would like to transition. That way it saves on performance from having to animate every possible property on the element that you're styling. So our background color should just be set to hover. Let's give that a hover. That's looking good with our transition. Next up, we want to get our focus styles in there. So skip nav focus. When this receives focus, we want it to have an outline of 0.2 rems. It'll be solid, and we'll use that new slate blue color that we covered in the last episode as our focus style. With this outline, we'd also like to add a little bit of an offset to it. So I'll outline offset of 0.2 rem as well. And if we give that a save, remember that we forced our focus state, and this should actually be 0.4 rem to match our design. Not the offset, but the outline itself. Okay, that's looking better. So now we can see that its positioning is pretty far off from where we want it. So if we were to take a look at this, we know that we want it to be 32 pixels if we don't count the outline here, and 128 from the left. So this would be just for desktop only, and we will also address this on mobile. So as I mentioned, it'll only appear on screen when it has an active focus state. And what we're going to do is basically transform it off the page in our default state when it's unfocused, and then transform it, or translate, I should say, back onto the page when it does receive focus so it's visible. So let's first hide it, and then since we have the focus state forced on here, we'll want to take that off just for a moment. And we're going to use transform to achieve that. So transform. And because we want it to only slide vertically down, what we'll want to do is make sure we translate to the right the same amount at all times, and we'll simply update the translation on the y-axis so that way it just slides down vertically, nice and neat. In our transform, we're going to do translate. This will include both the x and y values. On the x, we'll want to translate it space oct, which is 128 pixels. And then on the y, we're actually going to want to send this up at a negative distance. Now, since we're using a variable and we want to send it up a negative distance, let's use calc. And what we can do is bring in our space quad variable here, and then actually multiply that by a -1. And that should move it up -64 pixels from where it typically wants to sit. In order for this translation to work properly, let's also make sure that it's position absolute, so that way it doesn't interfere with the content flow of the rest of the items here. If we give that a save, we should see that disappear. It doesn't affect the layout of any of the surrounding elements. And if we were to now give this a focus, what we should add is our focus transform. So let's copy this transform over into our focus state. And the thing that we want to update here is, instead of translating y by -64 pixels, we instead simply want to bring it down to be the positive space double value of 32 pixels. Make sure we remove any unnecessary parentheses here, and clean up this calc that we no longer need. Looks like we're missing a parenthesis on the end here. Let's add that back in. Give that a save. That should be all good. Now, if we were to force the focus state, we can see that it translates onto the page for desktop where we'd expect. Let's add our transition for transform in here. So we'll save our transition. We're still using the same timing and easing curve here, and we'll set it on the transform property. So now if we give that a save, we can take focus off. That should go swipe up vertically. And once we receive focus, it should come down to the page. We can actually take this off in DevTools now. And if we were to back up our tab focus, I'm just using Shift Tab here to move backwards up the DOM tree. Once we focus on the skip to nav link, it appears on the page. If we were to hit enter, it would actually bring us to the main content anchor tag that we put in on a previous episode when we were handling the HTML. And so it works as expected. Now we are able to immediately engage with the main content of the page. And if we were using a screen reader, that would save us a ton of time from having to manually tab through all of these interactive elements in the global navigation, the mobile menu, all of those things, just to be able to get to our article content. So this provides a great shortcut for people who are relying on keyboard navigation or screen readers. So as I mentioned, that's the position we want for our desktop version of the skip-nav. If we reference our mobile mockups, let's take a look at where we want it there. So it looks like we come down 16 pixels and to the left 16 pixels. Now you can see above in our type spec classes, we use this generic mobile breakpoint of 575, and I think we'll carry that on. But what we'll want to do at this stage is, as we start building things out in terms of our responsive design, is just to keep adjusting the viewport, checking things, making sure they make sense, making sure the spacing looks good for the available space, and add media queries with whatever value we see fit. So I don't mind too much having what seems like random numbers as media queries when they're more precise and custom tailored to each component's layout. But as a start, let's just use 575 as a good guess threshold for these changes. So with the skip nav itself, we'll want to encapsulate this default transform in a media query, and the same with the focus state. And then we'll add mobile specific translation values, so that way it's positioned closer to the top left corner for mobile. So media min width, this will be our 576 pixel breakpoint and above. And we can actually take this and holding the Alt or Option key and using the arrow keys, we can just bring that line into a new block. Let's make sure we actually have the selector repeated in here. And again, using the Alt or Option and arrow keys, we can move that into our block. Get rid of any unnecessary space there. That's looking good. If we give this a save and bring back our focus state, nothing should have changed just yet. Let's make sure we replicate the same thing for our focus state on desktop. Skip nav focus, and we'll instead copy over this transform statement, paste that in. It's looking good. All right, last thing we need to do is handle the mobile spacing for this. So we'll add another media query, a max width of 575 pixels, and we'll take this same transform, but modify it for that mobile layout. So our translation on the X, instead of space oct, it'll be space default actually. We'll need to keep the same Y translation to make sure it goes completely off the page. We can copy this over for our focus state. Add our pseudo selector. And for the Y translation, instead of space double, we'll want to reduce that down to just be space default. Give that a save. Now, using our inspector tools, let's go into responsive design mode and give it that check. It looks like our spacing is what we'd expect to see here. And if we go above our breakpoint, you can even see it animating between those states. We can always adjust these media queries as needed, but this is just a nice good start. All right, so that should take care of our skip nav link. And if we take off our focus state, we should see that go away. Next up, what we can do is focus on the global navigation of our design. And I really prefer a mobile first workflow. So what we're gonna do is actually focus on our mobile mockups here, get everything working as we'd like, and then we'll expand the screen size and accommodate our larger devices as needed to achieve this desktop appearance. So we'll take a look at our mobile mockup here. And the first thing we can do is get our brand styled as needed. So in our HTML, we have our anchor tag in the header here with text of nutrition. We can add a class of tbrand. And if we give this a save, it should start looking like our brand, but we'll need to add a couple additional details here. So in addition to the typography class, we can give this a class of brand as a block. Come down here and let's make a couple section comments here. So this will be the header section, and within that we will be styling the brand. So in our brand here, we obviously need to get our color fixed up. So color charcoal 21 is the default. We'll get rid of the text decoration in this case. Give that a quick save. That's looking good. Let's make sure we have our hover styles accounted for. So the color in this case will lighten to color charcoal 46. Give that a save. Give that a quick check. We need to include our transition here. So on the brand block, let's say transition is equal to the variable transition, and we're animating the color property. Save that. That's looking good and matches the pattern that we established earlier when we discussed our designs, where any of the primary grays will hover to that secondary gray. The only exception to that would be the state of these cards or the skip-nav link, which start out as that dark gray and need to animate to be darker to match the pattern that we found in our other featured article card. So that's looking good. Let's make sure that we also account for our focus state with everything that we're touching. So brand focus. And we can actually do something very similar to what we did with our skip-nav link here. We can copy this outline of 4 pixels solid and an offset. Copy that down into here. Give that a save. Let's check this out. Let's actually force focus state. Just make sure we like what we see. That's looking good. Obviously, we'll have to address some of the spacing here, which we'll do in just a second. But that's looking nice. So while our brand component doesn't change based on the breakpoint, we should really be tackling the responsive layout of the header as a whole as a nice starting place. Let me get my tools engaged back in Figma here, and that way we can inspect the different properties of these elements. So if we were to look at the header, it looks like we're going to have a starting height of 64 pixels on mobile, and we can also look at the padding values within that. In our HTML, we actually need to target the header directly. So let's add a class of header, give that a save. We can come into our header section that we already created here. And we know that for mobile, let's actually bring this into a media query as a start. Max width of 575 as a starting place. Our header will have a min height of our space quad. Give that a save. Check back on our design here. So this is an important illustration of why we used min height instead of height. If we used height, it would force all of these extra elements to be overflown in the design. And while obviously we would want to account for that in our layout and nothing really should be overflowing, an important consideration is a lot of users zoom the UI up and down for legibility. And if you have an explicit height set, sometimes when users zoom the UI up to 200, sometimes 300%, so it's more legible for them, you can have text that wraps to new lines, and it can really break your layout. But if you always set boundary boxes on UI elements with min height instead of a fixed height, this would allow the header to grow as needed to accommodate different browser zoom levels without any issue in the layout. Let's return that back to 100% zoom. And since this was within our mobile media query, let's get our responsive design tools going. 320 by 480 is kind of the worst case scenario for mobile that we'll be taking care of. So we'll just keep it locked right here. And if it works at this screen size, it really should be a usable experience for any breakpoint. And you'll notice since we started out with just raw HTML, obviously our design already is very responsive. It's very usable on a phone. And so our main goal with this is, as we introduce CSS, is to basically not break the inherently responsive nature of this UI that we're building out. So if we inspect our header, we can see that it's obviously growing to 320 pixels tall, but we'll take care of that as we hide elements as needed and give it the proper layout. Going back to our design, we can inspect the spacing around elements. So it looks like we want 16 pixel padding left and right. And then regardless of the height of any of these internal elements, we'll want them to be vertically aligned to the center. So let's get our padding established within our breakpoint here. And instead of setting padding on everything, let's just be a little more explicit by doing padding right is equal to space default. And then padding left is equal to space default as well. The reason why I'm doing right and then left is because of the box model, which is top, right, bottom, left. So when I write individual margins or paddings, I just like to follow the sequence to keep everything nice and organized. So our padding right and padding left, where that space default values, we should see that take effect. And on our header at all sizes, we'll want it to be display flex. We'll want the flex direction to be row. We can actually change this to be flex flow. And we'll say row with no wrap. Give that a save. So notice everything is going to be in line now. We'll take care of that in just a second. We'll want to align items center and then justify content space between. It's looking pretty good. Obviously, our header height is still blown out. We'll take care of that by hiding various elements in just a moment here. So what we can start with is styling our open search button. If we look at our designs, this is kind of the trigger that will expand the search form as needed. And so we can take this open search button and turn it into an icon button. So after our brand, let's add a new section for the search. And let's call this the search trigger as our button name. Let's go ahead and get that added to the button itself. Search trigger looks good. And what we can start with is by removing some of the default styles that we know we won't need. So there shouldn't be any background color on this. So we'll set it to be transparent. We'll tell it to have a border of none. It's looking good. And we'll also want to visually hide the text as well as bring in our SVG icon. So let's go into our assets folder, go into icons. In this case, it'll be icon search. We're going to actually inline all of our SVGs just to save on server requests. So we can copy this out. And within our button, let's break this to a new line. We'll want the hidden label text to come first, and then directly after that, we'll have our SVG itself. Around this hidden text, we can wrap it in a span, and that can have a class of screen reader only, which is a class that we'll need to create real quick. Let's make sure our text is within that span. Paste that in. If we give that a save, right now we have the text and the icon showing. So let's go ahead and create that utility class I mentioned. We're visually hiding elements, but still making sure they're accessible for screen readers and SEO purposes. So there are a number of techniques for visually hiding text and still making it accessible, but let's just go through the one that I typically use. Let's add a quick section comment here. And we'll just say screen reader only. Pop in that utility class name. And the first thing we're going to do is take off any padding on the element that we're trying to visually hide. We'll set its width explicitly to be 1 pixel, the height as 1 pixel. And the reason why we're not using rems here is just as a safeguard to make sure that it's always guaranteed to be 1 pixel, regardless of base browser settings for font size or any zoom on the window. We just always want to force it to be 1 pixel in each direction. Next up, we're going to say position absolute. And so now we actually are going to use clip. We're going to clip it with a rectangular path down to 1 pixel in all dimensions. Clip is a slightly older CSS property that is actually getting deprecated. So in addition to clip, we're going to use clip path. which is a newer property. It doesn't have perfect support across the board, so we're going to include both just as a safeguard. And with clip path, we'll use an inset path, and we'll set it to be 0 pixels, 0 pixels, 99.9%, and 99.9%. And it's important to note that clip has commas between each value, whereas clip path, the inset property, does not. Last up, let's set overflow hidden and a border of 0 as well. If we give that a save, we should notice that our text for the search icon button has gone away completely. If we inspect it, it's only 1 pixel by 1 pixel in the DOM, but thanks to clip and the absolute positioning, it shouldn't be visually shown and it shouldn't affect any surrounding layout. All right, so we can continue on with our open search button, the search trigger as we called it. And let's make sure that the icon itself is styled appropriately. So in order to do that, let's go into our SVG here and let's give it a class of search trigger icon and add a corresponding class in our CSS file here. This double underscore is the BEM syntax that's popular with writing CSS. And BEM stands for block element modifier. And you can research that further if you like, but it's basically just a nice naming convention for all class names to keep everything encapsulated per component and also have a lot of consistency in the formatting of what we write. For our search trigger icon, we'll want to set the fill to our default charcoal color. And then when the search trigger is hovered, we'll want the cursor to be pointer. And then also on hover, we'll want to go one layer deeper to the icon itself and update its fill to be the lighter gray that we have as our hover state. With that, we'll need to add a transition on the icon for the fill property. And if we give that a save, we should see our cursor pointer and that nice transition we added, which is working great. So the next thing we need to do is hide our global search form by default. In index.html, let's find that search form and give it a class. So we'll say that the class of this is just going to be search. Nice and straightforward. Let's create a new block here. Search by default will be display none. Because we don't want anybody interacting with the search form until they've clicked on this button and we've revealed it, we can actually use display none here because it doesn't need to be accessible to screen readers until the form is open. And at this stage, we won't be applying JavaScript to handle the click events, but what we will anticipate is the different states of each of these components. So when the search form receives a class of search is open, this is a modifier class on search itself, we can change its display back to block. And if we go into our index.html, we'll want to fake that state by just applying it manually for now. So search is open on the end there, and we should see it reappear. This will allow us to style it as needed. And then by default, we can remove this class. And maybe in the future, if we add JavaScript to this project, we can wire up the button to actually toggle this class as needed. And at that point, we'd also want to consider tab navigation patterns, focus management, things along those lines. So let's quickly reference the open state for mobile for our search. And you can see that it overlays the entirety of our header. And so we'll want it to span the full width that's available. We can see that we also have visually hidden the label for the form input. And we also have some nice styling around the form itself. So the first thing we can do is apply our screen reader only class to the form label. We give that a save. That should go away. Now we're left with just the text input itself as well as the search button. Let's be sure to add classes as needed to both the input and the search button. So this would be search input, and the button we can call search submit. That way everything in the form is taken care of, accounted for in the ways of classes. And when our search is open, we want it to be position absolute. That way it can sit on top of the rest of the header elements. In addition to that, we'll want it to be a width of 100% minus the padding on the left and right. So we can bring in calc for that, and it'll be 100% minus. In this case, we will have the left padding with space default and the right padding with space default as well. And the only reason why I'm doing these separately is just to make it more explicit around what we're doing with the width. We can give that a save. If we inspect the form exactly, we can see everything aligns as needed. Let's take a chance to inspect our search form in more detail here. So we can see that the height is set to 48 pixels. We'll have this bottom border, and it looks like our input will actually span pretty much the full width of this, at least visually, and then our search button will be tucked in on the right side here. So our input itself, we can give a height of 4.8 rems. Give that a quick save. It's looking good. Let's remove that border as a start. So border none. Actually, we'll need the border on the bottom. So we'll start off with border none. And then underneath that, we can say that the border bottom, in this case, let's inspect it real quick. Find our actual element here. It looks like it's a 2 pixel bottom border with charcoal 21. Border bottom, 0.2 rem. It'll be solid in this case. And we use our charcoal 21. If that is save, that's looking pretty good. We need to get our typography spec applied here. The text style is body. So let's get that added to our input and our file here. We can tag that on in front of search input, say T body. Give that another save. Looking even closer now. And let's also make sure that both the placeholder typography and the input typography have the correct colors. So we know we want the color when there's an active value to be the default charcoal. And then we'll also want to style the placeholder text as needed. Now, unfortunately, placeholder is kind of a tricky pseudo element to style consistently across browsers. So we'll have to do it a few different ways just to make sure we have good browser coverage. In this series, we're basically assuming that auto prefixing would happen at the end of the build pipeline for this project. But in order to verify that our placeholder styles are working correctly, we'll need to add some browser prefixes in addition to this placeholder pseudo selector. So in this case, the placeholder, we want to be our lighter charcoal value. And now we have to do a number of browser prefix pseudo selectors just to make sure we have good coverage across the board. So what we'll do is basically copy this block a number of times. So I'm holding Alt or Option and using Shift and the down arrow to duplicate it. And we'll have 4 different browser prefixes. So one more time. All right, this first one, instead of just placeholder, we'll target WebKit input placeholder. Next up is Moz placeholder. Then we have only a single colon here, MS input placeholder, and then a single colon Moz placeholder. So if we give that a save, everything should be correctly styled now. If we start typing, we get the correct colors that we want. For our active state, everything's shaping up pretty well. Now when this input has focus, let's get that targeted here. Search input focus. We'll want the border bottom to be that color slate blue that we added in a previous episode for all of our focus styles. So we'll change the border bottom color just to be specific here. and change that to be the slate blue. While we're at it, we'll want to add a transition using our global transition variable and target border bottom color. Give that a save. Now it's a subtle change here, but when you basically click into it, you can see that the bottom border changes to that color slate blue. All right, I think the last thing we need to do for this open search form is to get our search button styled to match the open search icon button that we created before. And we'll need to position it on top of this, get this input spanning the full available width, and that should do it for the open global search for mobile. So we can go over to our HTML file here. We'll want to wrap this search call to action text in a span for screen reader only. Expand that out using Alt or Option with the arrow keys to move it up. We'll grab this same SVG as before and paste it inside of our button. Now here's where we see that because we have a lot of similarities, it may be worth refactoring some of the naming around our search trigger and search trigger icon. So that way we don't have to redeclare a bunch of things. And in a way, this is really a standalone component that is being used in multiple ways. So we can abstract some of these patterns out into a standalone component, and then if needed, provide an additional BEM class specific to each use case. In our app.css, let's go to our search trigger up here. Now basically all of these styles that we used for the search trigger will really hold true for the submit button as well, but the submit button might have some additional positioning, so that might receive one more class on top of a base component class. So instead of search trigger, really this just is an icon button. So let's select each of these instances and we'll say button icon. And that way we can reuse this throughout our app anytime we have this repeated pattern. Let's give that a save and make sure we apply that as needed. Search trigger will be button icon. Give that a save there. And make sure we replace the search submit button with that as well. So we'll say that this is button icon. We'll leave the search submit block there for positioning in just a minute here. And replace this with button icon as well. That's save. Everything is looking much closer. Let's just go ahead and hide some of these menu and top navigation elements real quick, because we can get to those in just a minute, but it'd be good to finish out the open state for our search. So on nav, just temporarily, let's say that this is screen reader only, gets rid of all that. Okay, now we can really see what we're actually working with. Let's go ahead and make sure we inspect each of these buttons to make sure they have a good tab target size. It looks like our open search button here could use a slightly bigger tab target. Typically you want to go 40 or 48 pixels square is good for tab target sizes. And this is something that we'd probably want to share across all of our button icons as kind of a baseline. So let's go ahead and take care of that here as well. So here we can say that the min width is going to be 4 rems and the min height. Let's actually bump these up to be 4.8 rems, just to give it a nice size. And if we look at our button here, it looks like we'll need to take off some default padding on buttons, and then also make sure everything is vertically centered and horizontally centered as well. So let's set the padding to 0, and then we can just simply set the internal contents to be display flex. Let's align item center and justify content center as well. Give that a save. Buttons are looking good. They have a nice tab target. We'll need to actually position our search form now. So with our search submit button, let's create a class for that. And I think what we'll do for now is say position absolute. And that should be in reference to its parent. So let's say that search is position relative. Give that a save. And we'll want to pin it to the right 1.6 rems, or in our case, space default from the right. Give that a save, and make sure it's also pinned to the top as well. Give that one more save. Things are looking good. What we need to do at this stage is probably provide a background color on our form, or we can make the input span the full width and have that overlay on top of the global header beneath it. That might be the best solution in this case. So let's set the search input to be width 100%. Give that a save. It's looking good. It has our padding values as needed. Let's investigate why our submit button is offset from the right. And that looks like because we put right a space default, but since we already have the padding on the parent form element, we can instead just set that to be 0 as well. It's looking good. Let's give this a try. So imagine we'd be typing in here. If I tab onto this, we get a default focus style. Let's make sure that we add an explicit focus style for both search buttons. But if I were to hit enter here, we can imagine this sending off our search, and the tab order, everything visually is looking good. So on our button icon, let's tackle the focus state real quick to wrap things up for this episode. And we'll use that same outline that we've been using before. Paste that in there. Let's see how this looks. We may need to adjust the offset a little bit. Yep, and we're also getting this inner focus as well, which I believe is coming from Firefox. But what I'm seeing here is we probably don't really want at least this much outline offset. So let's get rid of that and see how that looks. We may even want to make it negative. Yeah, I think in this case, we'll actually want to inset it by the same amount, but inside of the element. So that way it fits neatly within its border box. All right, that's looking good. If we were to remove the search is open modifier in this case, we would see our global header shaping up so far. And we have all of our focus states of the elements accounted for. Everything's working as expected. This is probably a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode, we will tackle the menu item for mobile, as well as bringing the global header up to speed for our desktop layout and getting some additional media queries for those larger breakpoints.